Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Victober, the venerated BookTube event that celebrates the Victorians in all forms of their literature. Apparently, I am celebrating Victorian literature by reading you a Victorian poem every day in the month of October. Fine by me. like everything else that the Victorians did, they did poetry better than anybody. And I just recently found a new copy of the Penguin Book of Victorian Verse. It's not a new book, but I found this at the Brattle to replace the battered old copy that I've gone to over and over again. I thought the timing's perfect, so why not do that? And I was very tempted for today's reading to find a poem about the sands of Araby or the heat of Mesopotamia or something like that, something to stress the fact that it's a really hot day here in Boston. But you've heard enough of me on that subject, so I thought I'd go with something else. We've mentioned a few times during October that the Victorians wrote a great deal of nature poetry, and a lot of it was very syrupy because they sensed the rise of technology estranging them from the natural world. Now, if we talk about Victorian England, that was a myth. All throughout Victoria's reign, yes, industrialization was growing at a huge pace. Cities were becoming grimy, filthy places. People were migrating to the cities in order to make factory wages, some of which they would send back home, and putting up with any kind of inhuman treatment. A lot of this was before legislation was passed to alleviate inhuman treatment of workers. But even so, even at the peak of that industrialization, England under Victoria was still mostly rural. Train tracks were being extended into all corners of the country, but nevertheless. But the Victorians didn't care. Poets were reacting to a zeitgeist sensitivity. They were feeling like the natural world was going away. And they were also looking at the blight of the factory landscape in big cities and hating it because it was really hateable. It was really ugly and exploitative. And that's the poem that we're dealing with today. I'm not going to inflict a heat wave poem on you. Instead, I'm going to give you something about child labor laws. This is a fun channel. This is by Ernest Jones, and it is called "The Factory Town." And it's a trifle long. We're going to have to get used to that. Some Victorians did go on. The night had sunk along the city. It was a bleak and cheerless hour. The wild winds sang their solemn ditty, a cold gray wall and blackened tower. The factories gave forth lurid fires from pent-up hells within their breast. E'en Etna's burning wrath expires, but man's volcanoes never rest. Women, children, men were toiling, locked in dungeons close and black, life's fast-failing thread uncoiling round the wheel, the modern rack. Even the very stars seemed troubled with the mingled fume and roar. The city like a cauldron bubbled with its poison boiling o'er. For the reeking walls environ mingled groups of death and life, fellow workmen, flesh and iron, side by side in deadly strife. There, amid the wheels' dull droning and the heavy choking air, strength's repining, labor's groaning, and the throttling of despair. With the dust around them whirling, and the white cracked fevered lips, and the shuttle's ceaseless twirling, and the short life's toil eclipse. That's a looming shuttle, that's not a bus going somewhere. That's a weaving device. Stood half-naked infants shivering with heart frost amid the heat, manhood's shrunken sinews quivering to the engine's horrid beat. Woman's aching heart was throbbing with her wasting children's pain, while red Mammon's hand was robbing God's thought treasure from their brain. Yet their Lord bids proudly wander stranger eyes through factory scenes. Here are men and engines yonder. I see nothing but machines. Hark! Amid the bloodless slaughter comes the wailing of despair. Oh, for but one drop of water! Oh, for but one breath of air! One fresh touch of dewy grasses, just to cool the shriveled hand, just to catch one breeze that passes from some shady forest land. I'm not sure that any worker would have had time to say something like that. They would have been told to get back to work. No, though 'twas a night of summer, with a scent of new-mown hay, from where the moon, the fairies' mummer, on distant fields enchanted lay. On the lea land slept the cattle, freshness through the forest ran, while in Mammon's mighty battle, man was immolating man. While the rich, with power unstable, crushed the pauper's heart of pain, as though those rich were heirs to Abel, and the poor the sons of Cain. Just point out here, Cain's the one who killed Abel. That's okay. While the crowd from drowsy riot staggered past his church unknown, where his God in the great quiet preached the livelong night alone. While the bloated trader passes, lord of loom and lord of mill, on his pathway rush the masses, crushed beneath his stubborn will. Eager slaves, a willing Hariot, o'er their brethren's living road, drive him in his golden chariot, quickened by his golden road. Young forms with their Young forms with their pulses stifled, young heads with their eldered brain, young hearts of their spirit rifled, young lives sacrificed in vain. There they lie, the withered corpses, with not one regretful thought, trampled by thy fierce steam horses, England's mighty juggernaut. Over the solemn heaven arches, like a god's reproof, at the offering man has driven, to hell's altars loom and woof. Hear ye not the secret sighing, and the tear drop through the night? See ye not a nation dying for want of rest and air and light? Perishing for want of nature, crowded in the stifling town, dwarfed in brain and shrunk in stature, generations growing down. Thinner wanes the rural village, smokier lies the fallow plain, shrinks the cornfield's pleasant tillage, fades the orchard's rich domain. And a banished population festers in the fetid street. Give us, God, to save our nation, less of cotton, more of wheat. Take us back to lea and wild wood, back to the nature and to thee. To the child restore his childhood, to the man his dignity. Lo, the night hangs o'er the city, and the hours in fever fly, and the wild winds sing their ditty, and the generations die. So you see Ernest Jones ends with an echo of the first stanza, and just sings out the horrible evils of factory life. This was at a time when you could work 10 hours a day, you weren't guaranteed any kind of wage, you weren't guaranteed any kind of time off, when children worked right alongside their parents and were worked until they literally dropped, until they were literally asleep on their feet. It happened in America too, not just in Victorian England. Those children were often the foremost victims of these factories. The factories often included giant turbines or huge looms or pounding presses. And what would happen frequently is that the children would work until they were numb and catatonic with exhaustion. And when that happens, for a moment, your brain will simply shut off and you will slide over, and the children, women, men would fall into machinery and die. And not much was thought of it among the shop overseers, except that it would slow down the day's production. And naturally, the poet here dreams of abolishing all that. Let's go back to a simple folksy worship of God out in the fields growing wheat. When that was never going to happen, and he probably knew that. The key alteration was not to turn back the clock, but rather to improve those working conditions, so that people still have the steady wage of a factory job. So they still have the opportunities that exist in the city. How many people worked in factory jobs who went home and wrote for the presses that existed in the city that didn't exist in the country? And lots of other opportunities too. Not everybody could reach them. In fact, I bet most people couldn't. But they didn't exist at all in the country, which, as we've seen in a couple of romanticized poems, was the haunt of misery and want. Lots of sickness and pain in the country as well. The key there is not to shut down the turbines and send everybody back to the country. It's to improve those barbaric conditions. And that gradually has happened. A little. It gradually has happened, where you can't make children work physically. You can't make children work anymore. You have to send them to school. And you can't work people X number of hours without any relief whatsoever. The parallel that you could draw, if you wanted to make this poem contemporary, which is always a mistake to do, would be to think about how those marginal guarantees for worker well-being have been eroded by the fact that the 20th century is ruled by monopolies. By monopolies that are every bit as ruthless as the barons and the surfeited landlords and overseers that are mocked in this poem. There are 5 corporations, each one in our world today, each one of which is run by at most 1 or 2 people. They're not accountable to the law. They're not accountable to any kind of regulation, and they literally rule the world. Huge parts of the world. You can't go online unless you use Facebook. And Facebook is ruled by one person. Mark Zuckerberg has complete controlling interest in one of the most powerful companies in the world. A company with more people under its control than most countries in the world. No oversight on him at all. Every once in a while, he shamefacedly gets called up to Congress here in America, gets called up to Capitol Hill, utters a few weird banalities and pieties, and then goes right back to profiting off disinformation. So maybe the ills that this poem talks about have lots and lots of modern parallels. But I think it's interesting that these kinds of poems, there are plenty in this volume, that lament the dirt and the grime of the factory city. And we see, when we read Victorian literature, we see that the authors of Victorian literature, whenever they move the action to a country house, you've always got somebody bemoaning the fact that things aren't what they used to be, that the road runs right up to the house, that the mine is active again in the village and makes everything sooty and smelly and whatnot. Right alongside these kinds of poems admonishing all of that, there's also, as we've seen, and we'll see again, a huge genre of poems more and more wistfully praising the natural world. I don't know what kind of ironic counterpoint it makes to this whole poem, that I physically had to stop reading at the exact halfway point because of the sheer unearthly amount of noise directly outside my window. Maybe that's a reflection on the world that we're talking about here. But if that noise is the price I have to pay for being within shouting distance of a Dunkin' Donuts when I need hash browns, well, is it too high a price to pay? Not one to say. But I'm going to wrap this up for now. We'll be back tomorrow with more Victorian poetry. Who knows what we'll encounter? I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.